With the immediate success of the Airspeed Courier, first flown in April 1933, the Airspeed company soon turned their attention to developing a larger twin-engine derivative. Using the same design philosophy and as many existing components as possible, the newly christened Airspeed Envoy first flew on the 26th of June 1934. Within a week of its first flight, the Wolseley-powered prototype was being displayed to the public, and such was the confidence of the Airspeed company that even before the first flight, 6 airframes were under construction. With a single pilot up front and a payload of up to 8 passengers, the Envoy was certified at RAF Martlesham Heath by September 1934. For the forthcoming McRobertson Centenary Air Race in October 1934, the Airspeed directors privately sponsored, along with the Aeroplane Exchange and Mart, an Airspeed Courier to be flown by the Stoddart cousins. The Airspeed company also developed a racing version of the Envoy known as the Viceroy. One was sold to Captain Neville Stack and his flying partner Sidney Turner and entered in the race. Modifications from the standard machine included 2 much more powerful Armstrong Siddeley Cheetah engines, a large fuel tank, a narrowed fuselage without any unnecessary windows, and a faired-in tail wheel. After testing, the Viceroy was flown from Portsmouth to RAF Mildenhall for the start of the race. Unlike the Stoddarts, who finished the race, coming a very credible 6th, the Viceroy only made it as far as Athens, being withdrawn for several technical reasons, including problems with the brakes. Inevitably, an acrimonious court case followed. Stack and Turner sued Airspeed for breach of contract and misrepresentation concerning workmanship, and Airspeed counterclaimed over lack of HP payments. The case was found in Airspeed's favour. The machine was returned to them, and Stack and Turner had to pay considerable damages. Charles Ulm was a pioneer aviator from Melbourne, Australia. Close friend and business partner of Charles Kingsford Smith, he accompanied Smith on his record-breaking circumnavigation of Australia in 1927 and on the first Trans-Pacific crossing in 1928. By 1934, Ulm was planning to set up a regular airline service from the west coast of the USA to Australia via Honolulu, Fanning Island, Fiji and Auckland. Regular services would have been operated with Douglas DC-3s, but for route-proving purposes, Ulm ordered a modified Airspeed Envoy. Fitted with a long-range fuel tank that took up most of the cabin space and navigation equipment including direction-finding radio, the aircraft was extensively tested at Portsmouth before being dismantled and shipped to Montreal. The Pacific flight was to start from Oakland in California on the 3rd of December 1934. Charles Ulm is seen here on the morning of the 3rd, chatting to Amelia Earhart. Later that day he set off, accompanied by co-pilot George Littlejohn and navigator Leon Skilling. With a decent tailwind, there was every chance that the trio would break the record for the 2,400 miles from Oakland to Honolulu, but by the following morning they had not arrived. The crew transmitted several distress messages in Morse code, but their transmissions were too weak for the radio operators on Honolulu to take a bearing. Distress signals continued to be transmitted even after the aircraft had ditched, but in spite of an extensive search by sea and air, and the fact the aircraft probably floated for a couple of days, Ulm, Littlejohn and Skilling were never seen again. Neville Norway, then managing director of Airspeed, later commented in his autobiography that the Airspeed team had tried to put all 3 crew in the cockpit, and Ulm had resisted, moving the navigator into the empty space behind the fuel tank. Whilst this freed up space in the cockpit, the navigator could only communicate with the pilots via speaking tube. How much, if at all, this compromised navigation we will never know. In 1935, the Mitsubishi Company ordered the first of 6 Envoys for airline use in Japan. They also purchased a license for production, and to that end, a team of engineers came to Portsmouth. Curiously, they all carried Leica cameras, and even more curiously, their favourite weekend pastime was to visit Admiral Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, which was preserved then, and still is now, in the middle of Portsmouth Naval Dockyard. This activity was quietly notified to the British authorities. In spite of the skullduggery, Mitsubishi went on to produce 11 Envoys in Japan. By 1936, the Spanish Civil War had started, and both sides were trying to buy suitable aircraft. Airspeed test pilot Charles Coleman flew the prototype to Croydon, where he was paid £6,000 in cash by Spanish Republicans. The aircraft later fell into the hands of the Spanish nationalists when pilot Fernando Ryan Loring defected, taking the aircraft with him. It became the personal transport of General Emilio Mola, but Mola and all on board were killed in early 1937 when the aircraft flew into the side of a mountain in poor weather. Not all export attempts to Spain were successful, British government blocking several, but an enterprising Frenchman, Auguste Amstoy, was notably successful in supplying aircraft to the Republicans via his airline based in the Pyrenees. A less contentious aircraft for possible military use was the convertible Envoy. 7 were supplied to the South African government starting in 1936. A normal airliner for use in peacetime, it could be converted by 4 men in 4 hours to a light bomber with a forward-firing machine gun in an upper turret, and bomb racks or a bomb bay, depending on initial construction. The sole Airspeed Viceroy had been sulking in the back of the hangar at Portsmouth since late 1934. In the spring of 1936, Airspeed were delighted when Blue Flame distributors, whose job it was to fly newsreels and cinefilms all over Europe, wanted to buy the aircraft as high-speed transport. However, suspicions were aroused when the purchasers asked Airspeed to fit bomb racks. Evidently, the film was far too flammable to carry in the cabin. The true destination was soon revealed to be Ethiopia, where Emperor Haile Selassie needed a high-speed bomber to attack the Italian invaders. The Viceroy was certainly faster than contemporary Italian fighters, and anti-Italian sentiment was running high. Airspeeds agreed to carrying out the work, but before it could be completed, Ethiopia fell. Italy scored its only military victory since the fall of the Roman Empire, and Emperor Haile Selassie was evacuated to Great Britain to live in London and then Bath. The Viceroy was then sold to Captain Max Finlay, who intended to enter it in the Schlesinger Air Race in September 1936, but Comandante Carlos Crowell, representing the Spanish Republicans, offered Finlay a whopping £9,500 for the Viceroy. Finlay took the money, and having made a good profit, ordered a new Envoy from Airspeed to be modified to near Viceroy standard for the race. With a crew of 4 and wearing a race number that some might go to great lengths to avoid, the Envoy was first to be flagged off the start line in Portsmouth. The team were doing well and were possibly in second place when they landed to refuel at Abercorn in northern Rhodesia. Takeoff was going to be difficult. The airstrip was on a slope, the wind was blowing down the slope, and the choices were taking off into wind, uphill with trees to clear, or downhill with a tailwind. Finlay and his co-pilot Ken Waller were impatient, and instead of waiting for the wind to drop, as locals said it would in an hour or two as the sun went down, they decided to take off uphill into wind. The aircraft lifted off but couldn't clear the trees. It crashed and burned. Max Finlay and radio operator Mr. Morgan were both killed. In October 1936, the Air Ministry placed an order for 136 Airspeed Envoys. To be used as multi-role trainers, they were given the designation Airspeed Oxford and fitted with proper dual controls. Thanks to the antics of the Austrian corporal, over 8,800 were eventually produced. Envoy production was more modest, with this one, the 52nd and last to be produced, being delivered to the Royal Navy for communications duties. Very few Airspeed Envoys survived the Second World War. This one lasted at Nottingham until 1950. This Australian example, sold to Ansett in 1936, soldiered on until 1951. The very last survivor was the Swedish registered example. Bought by the Prince of Wales in 1936, later Edward VIII, after he abdicated, it was bought by the British government for use by the royal family. Used for communications duties during the war, it was later exported to Sweden. It crashed in 1955, and the remains were later burnt. Whilst no envoys survive, thanks to the 1939 spy film Q Planes, we can still enjoy a few seconds of one in flight. Thank you for watching.